Hey, boys and girls, I have another story for you today, and I want you to be thinking as you listen to this story about what's happening at the beginning of the story, the middle, and the ending, because we're going to write our own story about something that you have done, and that'll make sense when I show you at the end. But first, let's listen in. This book is called Fireflies. The story and pictures are by Julie Brinklow. Story and pictures by Julie Brinklow. So be thinking, what's happening in this story? Fireflies. On a summer evening, I looked up from dinner through the open window to the backyard. It was growing dark. My treehouse was a black shape in the tree, and I wouldn't go up there now. But something flickered there. A moment. I looked, and it was gone. It flickered again, over near the fence. Fireflies! Don't let your dinner get cold, said Mama. I forked the meat and corn and potatoes into my mouth. Please, may I go out? The fireflies. Mama smiled and Daddy nodded. Go ahead, they said. I ran from the table, down to the cellar to find a jar. I knew where to look, behind the stairs. The jars were dusty, and I polished one clean on my shirt. Then I ran back up 2 steps at a time. Holes, I remembered, so they can breathe. And as quietly as I could, so she wouldn't catch me dulling them, I poked holes in the top of the jar with Mama's scissors. The screen door banged behind me as I ran from the house. If someone said, "Don't slam it," I wasn't listening. I called to my friends in the street, "Fireflies!" But they had come before me with polished jars, and others were coming behind. They must have all seen him at the same time. The sky was darker now. My ears rang with crickets and my eyes stung from staring too long. I blinked hard as I watched them. Fireflies! Blinking on, blinking off, dipping low, soaring high above my head, making white patterns in the dark. We ran like crazy, barefoot in the grass. Catch them! Catch them! We cried, grasping at the lights. Have you ever tried to catch fireflies before? They can be tricky. Suddenly a voice called out above the others, "I caught one!" And it was my own. I thrust my hand into the jar and spread it open. The jar glowed like a moonlight, and I held it in my hands. I felt a tremble of joy and shouted, "I can catch hundreds!" Then we dashed about, waving our hands in the air like nets, catching 2, 10, hundreds of fireflies, thrusting them into jars, waving our hands for more. Then someone called from my house, "It's time to come in now!" And others called from other houses, and it was over. My friends took jars of fireflies to different homes. Look at all their jars all lit up. I climbed the stairs to my room and set the jar on my table by my bed. Mama kissed me and turned out the light. "I caught hundreds," I said. Daddy called from the hallway, "See you later, alligator." "After a while, crocodile," I called back. "I caught hundreds of fireflies." In the dark, I watched the fireflies from my bed. They blinked off and on, and the jar glowed like moonlight. But it was not the same. The fireflies beat their wings against the glass and fell to the bottom and lay there. Look at the difference from the first picture, where they're all flying around, to the second picture, kind of settling at the bottom. The light in the jar turned yellow, like a flashlight left on too long. I tried to swallow, but something in my throat would not go down. And the light grew dimmer, green, like moonlight underwater. I shut my eyes tight and pulled the pillow over my head. They were my fireflies. I caught them. They made moonlight in my jar. But the jar was nearly dark. flung off the covers. I went to the window, opened the jar, and aimed it at the stars. Fly! Then the jar began to glow, green, then gold, then white as the moon, and the fireflies poured out into the night. Fireflies! Blinking on, blinking off, dipping low, soaring high above my head, making circles around the moon like stars dancing. I held the jar, dark and empty, in my hands. The moonlight and the fireflies swam in my tears, but I could feel myself smiling. That's a feeling we call bittersweet, when he's sad because he let him go, but really he knows it was the right choice, right? Because the fireflies didn't like the jar. They weren't glowing for him. He realized he had to let him go, but it could feel sad when he worked so hard and wanted to keep him. Okay, so let's think about this story and how it had a beginning, a middle, and an end. Let's think. In this beginning, middle, end, did it happen over a long period of time? Yeah, it wasn't a long period, was it? It was one night, right? It started out, he was eating dinner, right? And then he noticed when he looked outside, a firefly blinking out by his treehouse. And he got excited because he realized, I want to go catch some fireflies, right? So he went outside after he got a jar from the cellar. It's like a fancy word for our basement, right? Usually it just means it's kind of not finished. It's more you store things down there, right? And he found the jars underneath the stairs and he polished it. He kind of cleaned it off on his shirt, maybe a little dusty, and took it outside. After he poked some holes, he even remembered it needed some holes, right? So I want you to think, so then at the beginning, the middle, he was outside, he caught them all, he brought them in, it was time for bed, and they were glowing bright, and then they started to get darker, and he realized just something wasn't right, and he needed to let him go. So the last thing he did was he opened the window, and he told them to fly away, right, and they flew away, and it made him a little sad, but he really was smiling about it because he knew the fireflies were free, and he could go chase some more tomorrow, maybe, right? Yeah, so that happened over one night. So I want you to think, in the file today, you can print this if you want. Miss G will have this for you if you want to print it. That has a spot for a beginning, a middle, and an end. You're going to draw 3 parts to a story. All you have to do today is draw it, okay? You don't have to do it on this. If you want to take a piece of paper and make 3 boxes for a beginning, a middle, and an end, or you can turn it this way, a beginning, a middle, and an end, then you can make your own 3 boxes. This is just one that you can print if you want to use it that way. Or you can just draw a line across the paper. You could have a line here and a line here. Then you'd have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I want you to think about one day of something that you've done. I started mine. I was thinking back to fall break of a fun trip that I did. When I went on fall break to Tennessee, we went to a place called Cades Cove, and we drove. It was early in the morning when it was still dark. So I showed that we were on the road, but I colored over to show that it was dark. We had to have our lights on to see. And when we got there, we drove on a road and we could see some animals. We got to hike on a trail. And at the very end, we saw a little creek before we were finished. And we saw some rocks and we thought, oh, we could go climb down to that creek and kind of explore in the creek, but still stay dry. Except if you notice in my picture, one of the little girls that was with me got too close to the water and she fell in. And it was kind of cold water because it was pretty chilly up on the mountain. And I drew her sad face because she was sad. But luckily she had some dry clothes in the car. And then we left. So that was the end of my story because that was the end of my Cades Cove trip. So I have my beginning picture, what happened in the middle, and the end, just from one day. Thinking about, just like in Fireflies, that was one night at his house, right? And all the details that came from that story. So I want you to think about a story you could tell me that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and draw that. Because on Wednesday, we're going to take these pictures and we're going to put some sentences to them to have a story that we can share with others about that has a beginning, a middle, and an ending to it. Okay? So you're going to draw them. You don't have to turn anything in today. You're just going to work on that beginning, middle, and end and getting your story thought out of what you want it to be. And then on Wednesday, we'll work on writing a sentence to show what happened in our story with our words also. We'll add those on another paper.